a curious connection between my mother's world and culture and the part of me that is Assyrian, and then a very small town in Maine. And of course, my name, unless you know anything about me, my name is going to tell you nothing about this part of me because it
Sure.
camouflages or just completely masks any of that.
Hello, Assyrian podcast listeners. It's Odessa here with episode 169 of the Assyrian podcast. Let me set the scene for you. It's February 2022. I'm searching through scholarships that would be applicable to the general students I work with who are the first in their families to go to college, also known as first-gen students. And I stumble upon a scholarship for $30,000+ on a popular scholarship website that is called bowl.org. And the scholarship reads, Rita's first-gen scholarship. My grandmother was an Assyrian immigrant who grew up and suffered persecution in the Soviet Union. Her family fled to Iran where, believing passionately in education, she worked to help her 3 brothers attend school despite not having the opportunity to complete high school herself. After marrying a U.S. soldier and moving to America, she had a son, my father. She worked as a waitress and then in a factory, learning English, her 5th language, along the way. My father grew up to be the first in his family to finish high school and get a college degree. A career diplomat, he became a U.S. ambassador. His children, myself included, never had to worry about access to education. This is all thanks to my grandmother, who desperately wanted an education for herself, but sacrificed for others instead. She elevated the course of our family's trajectory forever. I would like to honor her by changing the course for someone else. Just imagine, as I was reading this, all the hairs on my arms stood up, because how often does it happen that you come across a scholarship that mentions the word Assyrian and is open to all? I did a quick scholarship search to find Claire Wooster, the granddaughter of Rita, who had put together the scholarship, and had to find out more. We connect, and she tells me the wonderful story of her grandmother, the motivation behind the scholarship, and mentions her father, Henry Wooster, who just so happens to be the U.S. ambassador to Jordan. What? An Assyrian who is a U.S. ambassador? And then it struck me that Rain Hannah of the Assyrian Policy Institute mentioned him to me years back, and that it would be great to have him on the podcast. Well, thanks to Claire, I connected with Ambassador Wooster and had a chance to hear more about his life, his upbringing, his work as a diplomat, and honoring his mother and her legacy through the scholarship. He has a great story, and I know you'll enjoy this interview. This episode is sponsored by the Oshana Partners, a husband and wife real estate team. Are you considering purchasing or selling a home in Arizona or California? John and Rita are available to help make your next real estate decision into a seamless transaction. Contact the Oshanas at 209-968-9519. Get to know them a bit more by checking out their website, theoshanapartners.com. That's OUSHANA. Want to advertise with us? We've got a worldwide audience just waiting to hear about your business. To inquire, send us an email at info@assyrianpodcast.com. And without further ado, here is Ambassador Henry Wooster. Well, Ambassador Wooster, thank you so much for accepting the invitation to be on the Assyrian podcast. Like I had mentioned to you, the world is very small, and being able to connect with your daughter and then hearing about you and the work that you do, I knew I had to connect with you and get you on the podcast. So thank you so much.
No, my great pleasure. I'm delighted to be here.
So could you start by telling me a little bit about your parents and the story of how they met?
How much time do you have? Yeah, of course. So my father was a Maine Yankee, generations of Maine in him, and he joined the Army. Is the short version, and made a career of it. And so at some point in his career, where were we? Roughly the midway point in his career, he volunteered for assignment to what in those days used to be called the Armish MAG. So MAG stood for Military Assistance Advisory Group. I don't know why they just didn't call it Army, but anyway, they were charged with training, obviously in the era of the Shah, various components of the Iranian military. So my father was one of the military trainers And I think in his case, it was with the when there used to be such a thing as the Pahlavi Brigade. I
Mm.
think that was the group that he was dealing with most of the time. And so that's what he did. Now, my mother, now here there's a windy long story how she ends up in Iran, because it's, for most listeners, particularly if they are of Assyrian heritage, they'll think, well, of course we know that tribe or that crew, but they will not be entirely correct, but I'll understand the assumption. How does she meet my dad? She meets my dad by virtue of just a little bit of history. And so it works quickly like this. So her mother is from, or mother's family, excuse me, are from the area that today you and I, or any person in the 21st century, would understand is predominantly what are within the contours of southeastern Turkey. It's so
Okay.
close to the Iran border that before people were more particular about borders,
They were porous.
yeah, a little here, a little there. And then my mother's father's family are from, well, the Hakkari Mountains. And of course, the mountains are huge. So you might be asking, well, where in there? And that's a more particularized story. But anyway, so he's from there and she is from the other part. So on a map, fundamentally the same sort of footprint of southeastern Turkey. But to the best of my knowledge, neither they nor any of their own direct family members had any contact with one another in those days in that area. How did they come into contact? They came into contact fleeing that part of the world around the time of the Armenian, what's commonly referred to as the Armenian genocide. But in Assyrian, we also have a Sefo. We also have a term for this period. So her father's family and her mother's family, independently, of course, both fled that area and headed up to what in those days used to be Christian Russia. And I say that because it was before the Soviet Revolution, which of course then it's officially agnostic and so forth. So they both headed north, both families. I'm not sure of the particulars of how my grandfather's family fared, but his parents were killed. So he was not fleeing with his mother and father. He was fleeing with an uncle who I think in truth was more like uncle, was more of an elastic term. He was maybe more like a close friend of the family, maybe a second uncle, properly speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And my maternal grandmother's family were headed up through the Caucasus as well. Anyway, the two of them, my grandmother and grandfather, meet and marry in what you and I today would know as Ukraine, and even the period they married, it came to be, of course, the Soviet Union. And eventually, my grandfather, my father's mother, he gets the dreaded knock on the door in the late 1930s in Kiev, which is where they were living at the time. And so he was sent off to the Gulag, to Siberia. And this was 1937, which was sort of the peak of that kind of thing. And in his case, interesting again, perhaps for our Assyrian audience, this was less about being Assyrian per se, but it was more about being among the mongrel group of untrustworthy or people for whom they had reason to be suspicious. So he was not an intellectual. He was not educated. He was literate, but he wasn't educated and he was not politically active. So you might naturally and rightly be wondering, what's the threat here? Well, the threat was you from a suspicious ethnic group, meaning you're not proven to be reliable. So therefore you are suspicious, even if you haven't done anything. That's just bad. So off you go. Weirdly, perversely, cosmically, if you believe in fate or absurdity or providence, my grandfather, while he is in prison, or in the Gulag more properly, the Second World War opens. And at that point, the Soviet Union, to include even in the punishment camps, realized, hey, we need to feed and arm the Red Army, and we can't afford to just be merely punitive. We need to sustain the Red Army. So a long story short, he got put in a forced collective farm. And at that point, after 2 years where my grandmother, and of course my mother, had no idea. They were told he was dead and they should assume he's dead. A long story short, through an underground network, really just Assyrian ethnic underground network of mothers, wives, That's how they, just trading rumor. Probably 90% of it is misinformed, and maybe 10% has some truth, not out of intent to trade
Mhm.
bad information. They just, by the time it's like that children's game at a party, you have little Susie say blue cat, and by the time it gets to Johnny, who's three people away, it's purple umbrella, right?
Mhm.
So the information gets garbled along the way. Anyway, at the end of the Second World War, and I'm sorry, they were able to join him on the forced collective because at that point, the more the merrier, putting their back to the grindstone or the wheel to support the Red Army. They were able to join him. At the end of the Second World War, when the Soviet Union was still fairly chaotic because it had a devastating effect. Well, any war is devastating, but certainly the Soviet Union had lost millions and millions of people, and things were a bit loosey-goosey. So my mother's father was making a decision about should I stay or go. Some of his closest friends, no surprise here, Assyrians, and now the men, and again, similarly, who many of them had been in the gulag with him or on the forced collective, they would pass messages back and forth. Some of them had left to go back into Russia, Russia in the sense of Ukraine, Russia, Moscow, Kiev, the major cities.
Mhm.
And some had gone to Iran because the word amongst the Assyrian community, at least those of them in my grandfather's circle, was it's, quote, okay, end of quote, there again to be an Assyrian, to go back. So what they did was they set up a code, and the code was you send a picture when you can, those of you who are already in Iran. And if anyone in that picture is lying down sideways, that is an indicator. That's the signal that it's not okay to come.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Things are not good. If, however, no one in that photo is lying down, that's a thumbs up. It's good. Come on down, so to speak. Anyway, one day after receiving several of the other pictures, they got one of these, which was you and I would call in colloquial English a thumbs up. And so they went and they bribed their way. They had worked their way over from Siberia, which in Russia or in today's Russian Federation, same then, meant you had to come from deeply into the interior where you were and work your way westward, and then come to what today you and I know as Azerbaijan, and to Baku. And then they bribed somebody on a steamship who took them to the then Iranian port of Pahlavi. The port's still there, but it's obviously got a different name today.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then worked their way down to Tehran. That's a very long way of telling you that's how my mother ended up in Tehran,
Mm.
and how my father ended up in Iran, and how they met was she began to work for an Armenian who ran a coffee shop. And because, of course, of the strictures in many of the Assyrian families about particularly daughters, and especially so then, where could she be out and working and mixing among others? Well, the Armenian qualified as a thumbs up because it was a fellow Christian.
Mhm.
That's just the blunt truth of it. And so she went to work there, and my father used to frequent that shop because they were one of the places where he could get a cup of coffee, not so much the Middle Eastern small, right, but the more standard cup of joe, as we'd say in modern day. And they actually, I think, had at least something resembling a donut. So my father, of course, as a good American GI, came to have a fondness for this place. Anyway, one thing led to another. And that's how they met. And that's probably the longest response you've ever had to a simple question.
No, that's great because that also answers the follow-up question that I had, which was if you had any understanding of where your mother's grandparents came from. So you had mentioned different parts of Southeast Turkey. Do you recall which villages or which tribes that they are a part of?
So funny you would say that because I have been in the midst of, for the past maybe year and a half, for the first time in my life, actually doing, albeit as an amateur, some amount of genealogical work.
Mhm.
So this has been aided in the modern era through DNA.
Mhm.
And also in the case of my father's side, pretty easy to find a lot of records, not everything, but many of them. So you can put together the tree. Well, my tree is very blossomed. It's rich with leaves and branches over on my father's side. And on my mother's side, because of all the things that the Assyrian people have been through, and primarily the destruction of records, fleeing from one place to another, I have very little except hearsay to go on. So my mother's brothers, two of the three of them, are still alive. They're both in the States, and I have gone over with them exactly this information. And, they're really they're really drawing from what they recollect. They don't have documentation. And so I don't have documentation. So all I have is very loose stuff. So unfortunately, I can't answer with much satisfaction for you or any presumed, particularly tribal historians who are out in the listening community about, okay, which millet exactly are we talking about here? So the short answer is I can't do you a lot of justice because I can't do much for myself. All I know is, again, with my grandfather, it was in the Hakari Mountains. And with my grandmother, it was down more in the lowlands.
So this kind of area and understanding in terms of trying to go back and understand that is a work in progress, you can say.
Yeah, it's a work in it's quite literally a work in progress.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, and I'd welcome if there's wisdom from any of your viewers about, hey, you might try this. I've had a very difficult. I've connected with DNA relatives who are Assyrian, at least those who voluntarily, click that button on Ancestry, Family Tree, 23, whichever thing they're using, and say they're willing to be connected. But they suffer from a similar thing. So that typically they'll, going back to grandma and grandpa isn't very difficult for most any of us. But getting past that, it's a cliff drop off in clarity about when, who, where. Did you know them?
What is your mother's maiden name?
Kako.
Kako. Okay. Well, maybe listeners might.
Well, the Slavic version was Kakovich, right?
Kakovich.
Because that was added on anybody who was living in that part of the world. But Kako was the original.
Kako.
Yeah.
Well, we might have a listener to have raised eyebrows and say, "Hey, maybe that's
right.
someone related to me."
Yeah.
Where were you born and raised?
Fort Jackson, South Carolina, courtesy of the U.S. Army. That's where I was born. But beyond being born there and spending the first couple of years of my life there, I honestly don't have any memories. Any memories of it I have really are from photos that my parents have from that time of the family, of me, picnics, that kind of thing. I was too young to actually carry any real memories of it. My first memories are back in Tehran because given my father's ties there and obviously my mother's, when they met and were married in Tehran, they then, of course, came to the States, I don't know, maybe a year and a half later. But by the time I was born, and with my father's military career moving about here and there, we found ourselves back in Iran. But the first time we found ourselves back in Iran, and I was aged maybe 2.5 to 3.5. So I have dim memories, just these flashing things in your head of like what today would be about the duration of a GIF, of a moment or a couple of these moments. Mm-hmm. I have that. And then Maine was where, when my father retired from the Army, we made it home. So a curious connection between my mother's world and culture and the part of me that is Assyrian, and then a very small town in Maine. And of course, my name, unless you know anything about me, my name is going to tell you nothing about this part of me because it camouflages or just completely masks any of that thing. And there were no Assyrians that I think my mother or I were ever aware of anywhere in Maine. Maybe at some point, one or another immigrant family had made their way to somewhere there at one point, but there was no community, and as best we knew, no other Assyrian anywhere in the state of Maine.
Sure.
But we would periodically go back to Iran and summers, things like this, and visit my grandparents. And at one point, we went back there. I did the 4th grade there. And so we stayed for a summer before it. We stayed through the school year. We stayed for a summer after it. So that was a more prolonged experience. And then once when I was, I think it was the summer when I was 14, we were back there again. So several trips back there. And of course, we would reconnect with the part of the family, which was the majority at that time, who were in Iran.
Do you recall your mom ever telling you about what the experience was like when she had met your husband and what she had told the family and how the family reacted? Was that common for Assyrian women at that time to get married to? I know I have my great aunt who married a German because
Yeah,
of,
right.
and she was in Iran and somehow ended up connecting with him. But I'm curious to know if she had ever told you of that story and if that was a tough conversation to have with the family, or if that was something that went well.
Yeah, I mean, my mother, you'd have to understand a little bit of her. In many ways, she was certainly by Assyrian traditional standards, a bit of a rebel.
Mm,
Well, I don't want to suggest anything strange, but my mother, so for instance, of course, a good Assyrian family, three boys, and my mother, she's the oldest. And the idea was the boys was we're going to try to get you educated best we can. And that worked out well for them. And my mother's case, it was like, okay, we got to get you as marriageable as we can. And so when the boys went off to, at least in Tehran, to the French Jesuit school,
mm.
to, of course, college preparation. And this was the path up and out. My mother was packed off with the sisters, the nuns, to learn how to sew and so forth, which, just really didn't click with my mother.
Mm.
Not any hostility or anything, but just not her speed. My mother is very extroverted, highly energetic. Just, her idea of the next step in my life, particularly as a young woman, was not that. So my mother, in cahoots with one of her pals, snuck out or would volunteer for reasons to sneak out. Oh, someone needs to go out to the bazaar and get whatever. Oh, sister, I can do that. Yeah, well, I'm sure it's no pain. It's no trouble. Sure, I'll go.
Mhm, mhm.
And of course, every opportunity she could to not sit in what she described as stultifying sewing classes. So she did that, and eventually, again, in cahoots with another one of her Assyrian friends, girlfriend, who turned, of course, who became a lifelong member of our broader family, because that girlfriend of hers, her daughter married my mother's brother. Anyway, long
Oh,
story
wow. So that
short,
was
they live now in California and all that stuff. But anyway, we'll step back from that just for a moment. The two of them, I'm not sure quite how, but the girlfriend had originally found this Armenian coffee shop and was working there and got my mother into it. So for a period of time, my mother was telling her, notably, most particularly her father, of course, her mother too, oh, yes, I'm continuing my sewing classes, when she wasn't. Uh,
ah.
yes, she was sneaking out the side door. Anyway, so yeah, it was a difficult thing because this is a guy coming from outside the culture. The family had been through a lot of tumult. I think the only the initial plus side he had going for him was, okay, well, whatever we do or don't know about him, he is a Christian,
Mhm.
which was a question. And again, in the interest of candor, just amongst listeners who I know are not shocked by that if they weren't born into the Assyrian world this morning. So that was a key criterion, and my father checked that box. And then they eventually, as they realized this is looking like it's going somewhere, wanted to get a background check on him, which they, as I don't know if it was in the engagement or I guess maybe just before that, before they would assent to it, it was, we need to know a little something. So I still have the paperwork, which my father has attesting from the U.S. Embassy and from his commander that no, in fact, he was not a known felon or anything else, or didn't have a criminal record, or more particularly, a previous family.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah, because that's how the Assyrian network works anyway,
yeah,
right? The first thing they want to know, who is he? Who is his family? And so if he's not
exactly.
Assyrian, they've got to have some sort of reference point. So
They couldn't do
amazing
the
that he had the
traditional.
reference papers to show.
Well, he got them. I mean,
Yeah,
because he was asked. I don't think he had them as a
sure,
matter
sure.
of course, but he had to develop them. And then, as a condition of, eventually, as a condition of marriage, he did. In fact, my mother had to get checked out by the U.S. government.
Mm,
Particularly, this is the Cold War, and my mother's born in the Soviet Union.
mhm.
And so they are not thinking about the Assyrian thing. They're just thinking, oh my God, she's a red.
Right.
And so they've got to check her out and get her cleared. So they did. And then my father likewise had to get, it seems medieval maybe to modern listeners, but permission. My father, the American, also had to get permission through American channels to get married.
Mm.
So, they got married in 1958.
And was your mother the first of her family to immigrate to the United States after that?
She was.
Okay.
She absolutely was. And her parents only were able to join as a result of going through the usual petitioning
Mm.
exercise in the
Mhm.
American immigration system for a
Mhm.
member of family. But
Mhm.
at that time, the Iranian Revolution had already begun cracking off. And so we had to go to extraordinary lengths to get them a visa and to get them to the States. It didn't work so smoothly with my mother's youngest brother. He ended up spending a couple of years in Spain as kind of a midway point, waiting and waiting and waiting for the paperwork to work out. The two other brothers had come as they weren't married, and they came as students, and then eventually they stayed and became green card holders and then citizens and were married and so forth and etc. But
Mhm.
so their journeys, if you will, were a bit easier, but the real pull was getting finally my uncle, the one who ended up in Spain for a few years, and my grandparents who were in Tehran, getting
Mhm.
them out to the States. But the
Mhm.
good news is everybody made it. Everybody got out, and everybody was more particularly reunited in the States.
Sure. Yeah. Ambassador Yusuf, for yourself, how did the Assyrian influence show up for you as you were growing up, if at all? Do you recall any recollections or memories of like foods or gatherings or
Right.
even your time in Tehran?
Yeah, very much so. So, growing up in a very small town, there were many benefits, part of which is everybody knows everyone. And there are
Mm.
many downsides, which you probably guessed it, is everybody knows everyone. So, my mother was exotic by local standards. And most people, despite northern New England, Maine Yankee culture not being celebrated for, being warm and embracing, the fact is you just need to get to know them,
Mm.
right? And it isn't quite as it's not the same maybe as some other parts of the U.S. or other parts of the world. But the fact is that my mother plunged in. She began working as a waitress at a local diner, and then she began working at a local factory where she stayed and retired with GTE Sylvania. And she made a huge bevy of friends and really, plugged herself into life there. My father, oddly, although from there, for generations, my dad was not an extrovert.
Mm.
So that's not so much odd per se, but he actually was surrounded by a lot of history and a lot of family ties. But, it just wasn't the
Mm.
same. The family didn't really, outside of the very immediate family, didn't really gather so much. So my mother really, in my view, made up for a lot of that by really pulling a lot of people together. In terms of the Assyrian elements of it, yes, it took me a long time. A long time. It took me, I don't know, at some point into my teen years to realize, oh yeah, not everybody eats, say, kipte or whatever. And yeah, they look at this in front of them and think, this is kind of cool because it's meat, particularly boys. But what is this exactly? And my mother was heavy, of course, on the Assyrian motherly chul, 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 push, push with all the food. So, there's no boy, particularly a growing boy or young male, who doesn't find that just, hey, this is terrific. I
Mm.
love being at your house. And my mother was just very warm and welcoming by nature. So that was a huge boon. But yes, we did go to Assyrian conventions, not every one all the time, but I would attend some number of those with my mother. Look, as a kid, I wasn't too interested in whatever somebody was saying on a platform. You do a bit of sheikhani, and then you scoot, or you hope like, oh, can we leave? Can we? If the convention was in New York City, can we go see? I don't know why. Or when I was a little boy, go to a toy store.
Right.
I wasn't thinking about any of those issues. But I had one of my uncles who was very, I don't know, you and I could maybe call him nationalistic, but was a very committed Assyrian nationalist who wrote about it a lot and who was politically active. So
What
that
was his name?
Ivan Kakovich. And so that way he wrote a book on the Semel massacre. He wrote political manifestos, so forth and et cetera. So that was a different side of the education in terms of the Assyrian background. My mother was not at all interested in any of that, plugged into it. Also, that uncle was very outwardly secular. And in the Assyrian community, where the church plays a big role, a little awkward.
Mm.
So, and outspoken, not hostile, but just outspoken about his views. But he had a lot to do with educating me on a lot of the particulars, not so much on ancient history of, the Mesopotamian, the Assyrian, but not that, but more of, hey, here's who we were as a people, here's where we are, here's what we've tried to do, or those who've been active in these things. Here are the challenges to it. Here are the divisions and the reasons why, there are a group of Assyrians who are active, but who think we should move in this direction. Another one who active, but think we should move in the other direction. The ones from this part of wherever, say Iraq or Iran or the former Soviet Union, who have all the particularizations. And that, of course, if you're familiar with any ethnic group, you realize because you're part of that group, you're a Jew, you're an Armenian, you're Black, you're whoever, that doesn't mean, you all think alike.
Right.
All of you people.
Right.
Well, no, they don't. They have differing views about all kinds of things, including things that are very directly related to the identity of that group.
Right.
And so really he's responsible for directly and also indirectly educating me. And, to be clear, he didn't sit me down and try to indoctrinate me. He just had opinions. He was forceful about expressing them, or strong, maybe is a more gracious term. And he was also intellectually rigorous, so that, you couldn't just toss out a slogan or a bumper sticker, so to speak, and say, we're good, right? No, he wanted to examine it and challenge assumptions much more. And of course, I grew up with the various cultural aspects that any Assyrian will recognize, anything from aspects of the church and religious life to, yes, you mentioned, of course, food, holidays, expressions, including the things that also every group that I've ever been part of has, which has its own prejudices, has its own outlook. Maybe a polite term would be it has its own formed opinions.
Sure.
About things. So I also grew up with those. When you're around these people, you maneuver like this. Those people think this way, and you'll want to. Right. And so that's I was not immune to any, growing up with any of those as well.
Right.
But some of the benefits, really learning to adapt yourself nimbly to a variety of cultures as well as languages, some of them diametrically, so maybe not quite diametrically opposed, but some of them real oil and water mixes. And, I think it will go without saying that if somebody grows up that way and then, surprise, becomes a diplomat, you might draw from that experience. And absolutely, all the time. And the other aspect of it that's been indispensable to me, really, is just as a human being, but of course professionally, has been the requirement, because I didn't have a choice growing up, the requirement to understand different points of view and to realize, hey, they've got a point of view I share, or share some of, or don't share at all, or find abhorrent, as the case may be. But I know this person, I've been in their home, I've been to their weddings, I've been to their funerals, I've been to their and I have a certain sort of human empathy for them. And again, in my business, empathy is absolutely imperative, because you cannot understand someone else's point of view. You don't have to have sympathy. You may have it, but you don't have to have that professionally. Professionally, what is necessary is that you have empathy, because the empathy allows you to get inside someone else's space. I'm speaking figuratively, of course, and understand, or try to understand, why do you see the world this way?
Probably one of the most important skills to have.
I've been thankful for it. It hasn't made me a saint, but I've always been thankful for it.
Tell me the story of how you ended up attending boarding school and what the experience was like, and what it taught you.
Yeah. So my dad went to the ninth grade and dropped out. He joined the military, and the Army put him through a GED, general equivalency diploma, at some point. I can't remember exactly when. My mother came out of the war-torn Soviet Union and then went into Iran, and within Iran was part of a traditional Assyrian family. And you know what that means. And I think most of our listeners will appreciate it, which was as they came to work through the tier of where are we going to put the very scant family means and resources, it went to the boys, it went to her brothers, about which, by the way, my mother had no objection. She thought, oh, well, that's just the way things go.
Mm-hmm.
So in any event, my parents, it won't surprise you, prized education for me in the way that parents very typically have through time, which is, hey, whatever my story is, I want my daughter or my son to not have to have the same bruises and scars I had. Doesn't mean that you want them to have a padded life, insulated from life, but it does mean that I want the opportunities that are going to be available to you to be greater than those I had, particularly parents who came up in tough circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the case with my parents. And we had a minister in my hometown in Maine, who, of course, was educated, but was also more awake to both options and the lack of options. Mind you, this is a small town, and started to ask me from a relatively young age, when honestly I just wasn't thinking about these things, and more honestly didn't know how to think about them really, such as, so what do you think you're going to do with yourself? You seem to like books, and you like the outdoors, and you like sports. Well, I don't know, I'll join the Navy or the Army, or I'll join one of the branches of the military service. Or, maybe I could be a fish and game warden. Do you know what that is?
No.
They call it something different in Canada, like Department of Natural Resources.
Oh, okay.
They're the people who go out and make sure that you're not fishing or hunting illegal.
Sure.
So I loved to fish and hunt. I grew up in rural America, and I thought, wow, you mean I could get paid and I could carry a gun and I could be a good guy, cops and robbers sort of thing. And wow, I could get paid to be outdoors and do this. Oh my God, could it get any better? So for a time, that's what I thought, like, hey, this sounds just about perfect. As I started to get a little older, I began to think about college only in the very loose sense that, oh, that's an out there thing. And it seems to be that that's a good thing. My parents never pressured me about it. They just said, maybe one day you could do that. And that was really it. And, I don't think my parents in candor really knew more about it other than there are people who do that. Maybe you can be one. I don't think they knew how to go from point A to point B step by step. Anyway, so this minister actually knew a fair bit about Assyrians and was flabbergasted to find that my mother was one. He knew the history. He knew the story of the Nestorians. He knew about the various missionaries, particularly in Iran, and the 19th century Americans who got out there. And he was sort of gobsmacked that, really, you're an Assyrian? And he showed us this collection he had of his books on this. And he's a well-read guy. So at some point, I don't remember the precise transition, he continued periodically to ask me, so what are you going to do with yourself? And one day, I can't remember apropos of what, I think he was discussing with me a book I had read. And now and again, he would give me a book and say, if you like that, you might like this book. I, of course, at the time had no idea that these were what you and I would refer to as the classics. I had no clue. Like, oh, wow, this guy just seems to know good books. And we would discuss them. And I would say, mow the church lawn or be talking to him afterwards. And we would talk about that. And so one day he said to me, have you ever thought about boarding school, prep school? I had no idea what they were. Absolutely not any idea at all. It was completely outside the realm of my experience. And he said, here are some things you might think about. This would open some opportunities for you. And given the fact that you're a little, he was much more polite, a little strange already, where here you are, but you have this other side. You speak some other languages in varying degrees at that point, Assyrian and Russian. And you've spent some, again, relative to my age and stage of life, then some fair bit of time overseas. You might find that this would be something that you'd find an alignment with, that it might work. So he took me around to a couple of the schools, did tours in the same way you look at a college campus and take a tour. And, it started to get more complicated. I think my parents began to wonder, what are you doing here? Because as my dad said to me one day, places like that, about which he knew nothing either, they're not for people like us.
Mm.
Anyway, so the deal, such as a deal was you can continue to sort of pursue this, what I'm sure seemed to my parents, to my mother, I think a bit tantalizing, because she'd seen some of the doors that were open for her brothers. But at the same time, for my father, I think he was, to be honest, I think he was a little suspicious of what's the game here, because,
Mm.
we people who do that are not us. And, it's got to cost some outrageous amount of money. We don't have that kind of money. So the minister said, look, if the schools like Henry, and Henry likes the schools, they do have scholarships. And if at the end of the day, the scholarship that, assuming Henry pursues this, that he obtains, can't cover the costs, well, then that's the end of it. And if it can, would you be receptive? And I think my
Mm.
father just thought it was nutty.
Mm.
Not, it wasn't hostile. I just think he just couldn't understand how would, like, you're going
Sure.
to get something for nothing. It just
Yeah.
doesn't add up. Anyway, a long story short, I did go through the interviews. I went through you have to sit standardized exams just like you do for college with SATs and so forth, and interviews and one thing and another. And came the day when the announcements come out, just like with colleges and universities, there's a set date when they send out their admissions notifications and so forth. And it worked out, and I got enough of a scholarship that put my father mostly at ease. I think he was still wondering, oh, there's got to be a hook here that's weird.
Right.
It
There's
sounds,
got to be a catch.
what's going on, right? And then the boarding school I went to was both very international and what I can honestly say quite ecumenical. It was very deliberate
Mm.
about not being an elitist place, about really having a different tone about who they were and what the mission of the school was. And can you believe, I met other kids like me there, including other Assyrian American kids, not a ton of them,
Really? Oh,
yeah,
wow.
who in fact, weirdly, had been in school with me in Iran.
Oh my
If you
goodness.
can believe that. So to give you a sense of the kind of place. And it was a hugely enriching experience for me. I can say, in the most literal sense of the word, it changed my life. It was a very different education than I would have otherwise had access to. I'm making no claims of moral superiority here, just both in terms of the students who were there from around the world and around the country, in terms of the offerings, many of which honestly were over my head initially. And it was a struggle to get myself leveled off where, okay, this is going to work, where I'm not living in terror of failing out, and ideas that I had never come into contact with. I remember in the 10th grade stuff I read years later, read as a graduate student, that
Mm.
I had read there in the 10th grade. Now, obviously, the understanding I had in the 10th grade with the first encounter with that material and some of those thinkers was not the way I was thinking about it years later as a graduate student. But it was it was a life changer.
I'm curious to know because I never grew up with anybody that had gone to boarding school. At that point, did you ever think about the friends that you were growing up with and at school and thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to be away from them? And what about life here? Or, did the minister kind of paint a picture for you that was much more appealing that enticed you to, kind of
Um,
let that go even from
yeah,
a temporary time?
yeah. I mean, it's a tough time. It's always tough for a young person to leave their home, whatever, unless it's an absolutely hostile environment and they're desperate.
Sure.
It's always tough for a young person. They might have courageous thoughts or adventurous fantasies or something, but it's tough to walk away.
Yeah.
you walk away with the comfort that you're not leaving forever.
Yeah.
But, in my case, going off and getting that education, it really, I think when I came home the next time, I don't know if it was Thanksgiving or Christmas, but I think my parents sensed you're different now. I mean, you're not, you're still who you are.
Mm,
But in another way, you're different. And I felt it
mm,
on an interior level. And to be absolutely crystal clear about this, I didn't, as some to use a term I mentioned before, because I know the image of boarding schools is either a Dickensian hell, where they're beaten and treated cruelly, may I have another bowl of porridge or something, or a very elitist, snobby perspective. Of course, it wasn't either, and it was, yeah. I mean, I felt the separation from friends, not because they were willful about it or I was willful about it, but the friendships and the teammates and classmates, they were continuing that journey, and I, had taken a fork in the road, if you will. I was excited about my new friends, but I was sad to be away from my closest friends
mm.
right back home. So I'm still in contact with some of them, albeit in the way that middle-aged adults are anymore, which is, hey, on Facebook, oh, happy birthday, Susie,
Right.
right? But but I certainly have the memories and carry those, and it's just a part of who I am. I mean,
Sure.
that's my home, that's where I grew up. That will always be a part of me, notwithstanding the education.
Higher education, as I understand it, was very important to your mother. Where did you decide to go to college after boarding school?
I went to Amherst College in Massachusetts. That's where I graduated. I I had the benefit of, I think, I still think it now at this age of my life, and I thought it at the moment, of giving me a little too much benefit of the doubt
Mm,
in many ways because of folks who I thought I could see were better students than I was. And I was trying to forge an identity in two worlds at that point. One, probably any number of students were, I don't know everyone's stories, but I was very keen to be independent. So that meant that through the Army, I was doing ROTC, and it was a strange time for that because Amherst, like many colleges, had kicked ROTC off its campus during the Vietnam era.
mm,
So the way you did it was you went to a nearby university so many times a week, and you fulfilled your ROTC requirement, and they, in turn, the Army would send a check to your college, and you could fund your life.
mm,
So that was a little peculiar, and that had some demands on it that was outside, not unusual if you were a student who was working a lot to earn your way through school. But the thing about the Army was they had a way also of taking an ROTC, and at the time I was also in the reserves at the same time, and so that meant you spent weekends away. It was good because, for as far as I was concerned, I was getting paid for it. But also long breaks like spring break or winter break. That was an opportunity for the Army to send you to some more training,
mm.
and also in the summers. So, it was sort of a strange identity where one part of my life was over here and another part was in this traditional college liberal arts campus.
Mm. And what did you eventually end up graduating with, degree wise?
Religious studies was a strong interest of mine, not because I saw myself as a cleric, but the minister I'd mentioned in my hometown had a very formative influence on my life. I studied Russian as well, given the past I have spoken to you about. And those were all interests that later in my life continued, and in fact, in one or other form or fashion, still continue today. So STEM was unheard of. There were people who had interest in those issues, but no one was calling any of that stuff STEM in the day.
Right.
Computers, when I was an undergraduate, you went to the computer center. There were people didn't have PCs in their rooms. That was an unheard of luxury. You went to the computer center. There was this weird building, and it would crash regularly, and you'd lose whatever you were working on. It was a massive pain. Uh, anyway, and I didn't have any fantasy nor any talent that I was going to be a doctor, nor any interest in the hard sciences or engineering or any of these things. I was very much a humanities person. Math had been easy for me until algebra. And then algebra, I don't know why, it's like my brain went dead.
You and I both.
Yeah, and even at that point, I didn't have any illusion that I'll be a mathematician or a scientist. It just hadn't been problematic. But when it did become so, and it was more of a struggle, of course, it began to shut down options in terms of what you would study. But the positive way to look at it is, okay, what are my strengths and what are my talents and what are the things that are not going to be a winner for me? And that was, I had very few illusions about that.
And so how did you end up becoming a diplomat?
Well, like a lot of life, you've probably seen those charts, or it's often a meme. I know my kids have WhatsApped them, so I'm sure you've seen them before. Chart one is how you imagine the trajectory going from a linear, logical, sequential process between, you're born, you're raised, you go to school, and there's this straight line, and then there's one or another successful leap along a linear line to whatever it is that you do, right? But adulthood and some profession. And then there's the truer one that's much more realistic for most humans in life, and it's a squiggly, all over the map sort of place. And that's absolutely true for my life. It looked much more like that. So how did I end up becoming a diplomat? In between the service as an Army officer and then graduate school, I maintained interests in things that, well, actually what I told you about. So graduate school wise, I was studying at the same time philosophy, theology, and national security policy, Soviet military policy. And they were, they're not really complementary in a direct sense. And they're not framed in opposites either. But, the question was, what do you do with this? And this interest, which was pretty inchoate in terms of international events. And I had only the loosest sense of what foreign policy or security policy or diplomacy or any of these things really were about. I'd read about them in the same way everyone else who'd been a student had read about them. But I had no more coherent sense of what any of them really meant. And at some point, again, the vicissitudes of life or the accidents of it, if you prefer, you meet a professor or you take a course at some point and somebody discourages you, but somebody else encourages you. And that was really more of my story. And I knew that when I got out of graduate school, I wanted to find, if you will, and I'm saying this with humor because listeners can't see my face, but my fortune, so to speak, in Washington, D.C., because the government and the things that were about government, think tanks, the federal agencies of the U.S. government, the U.S. Congress, all of these things, the interests that I had really, they weren't in finance, i.e. New York. They were in Washington. So knowing not much more than that, I met my wife in graduate school. And so we were married on one day and we packed our car maybe 2 days at the most later, which, for newlywed graduate students is pretty much, if you can sell your books, it's down to a couple milk cases, those plastic milk carts that you have for furniture, and then maybe some ratty old car. And that was exactly us. And we drove down to Washington and stayed initially with my aunt and uncle, Assyrians. And we stayed initially with my aunt and uncle until we found jobs and got set up. And eventually, I don't know, maybe less than 2 years into it, I found myself taking a job at the State Department, not initially in the Foreign Service, in the civil service initially. And shortly thereafter, the Soviet Union dissolved. And while the corpse, if you will, of it was still warm, there was a search across the State Department for people who were willing to go out and open new embassies. And now these, suddenly we had the birth or premature birth in some cases of, they'd been a state of the Soviet Union. And now, on a Friday you're that, and the next morning you're, you're a country, and you need to start doing all the things countries do. And so I found myself involved in that because someone, a superior of mine, somebody I worked for, remembered, hey, you speak some Russian, right? You can recognize a Cyrillic letter,
Mhm.
and are you willing to go do this? And I said, sure, sounds fascinating. Anyway, one thing led to another. I really fell in love with the work in the field, working in embassies, working as a what we call a political officer, a reporting officer, which is really amounts to finding out, who are the political actors. A lot of that doesn't require the brain of Einstein or Kissinger, which is, okay, who's the minister of X and who's in charge of Y. The people who are beyond that in civil society, it's maybe a bit more homework, but you start to develop relationships with them. You determine, where is this, in this case, this new country going? What are the relationships like? What are their challenges? What are their talents, so forth and et cetera. And then, like a journalist who does a very similar sort of role, then you begin writing about it, and you begin, sending these reports in and formulating assessments and so forth. So that was originally how one thing led to another, one assignment led to another, and eventually I formally came into the Foreign Service.
That's amazing. Could you share some memorable experiences and places you've lived throughout your career?
Sure. Um, in Tajikistan, which was really my first diplomatic field assignment, I'd been on diplomatic, what we call TDYs. It's government speak for temporary duty. It means an assignment somewhere. An assignment on TDY could be for a day or a night, or it could be for 6 months or what have you. And so I spent some long TDYs in Dushanbe, Tajikistan in 92 and 93, helping establish the embassy, support what we were doing there. And so there's so many memories there. Tajikistan was, after its birth as a country for which, of course, it wasn't prepared, then it, through no fault of its own, it just suddenly, the plan, which had not been a plan, was, bang,
Mm.
everything had fallen apart. Working with people shoulder to shoulder, whether they were newly installed in government, and I'm thinking now not Americans, or whether they were what had been, particularly when I was a military officer, the Soviet menace, and sitting shoulder to shoulder with them now, trying to work out common problems, was a heady experience.
Mm.
I don't mean to say we were immediately fast friends or we were enemies. We had both been raised in quite different worlds and raised with ways to see the other, and also trained, not just in our households, in our society, but in our roles as military or government officials. And suddenly finding ourselves now kneecap to kneecap, eyeball to eyeball with each other, fortunately not pointing a gun at each other. I just can't say enough about what a heady experience that was. Heady in the sense that I think for both sides, trying to stumble our way through. For me, I'll never forget driving through what had, only shortly before and for decades been forbidden.
Mm.
It was verboten that any American could be in these places. And then pulling into these towns or these cities and these offices and meeting with people and talking with them, again, which was just unthinkable because you were in the equivalent of what had been denied territory before. That was a remarkable experience. We were then in Moscow briefly, which was, again, a remarkable experience because things were still very touch and go with the Russian Federation, not so much in terms of hostilities, but more of how was it going to be forming and shaping. I remember going out to Siberia in December of 93 for elections that they were holding on their constitution and status. And again, it was obviously winter. And here we were, Americans trotting around observing the elections and talking with Russian officials. And for both of us, it was just weird. It was sort of like Martians meeting people from Earth and people from Earth meeting Martians. And then in Tbilisi, Georgia, for a few years with my family. Again, they're coming out of their own civil war as well. And here is Edward Shevardnadze, who for me had been this far distant, removed world figure, who now I was sitting in meetings with my ambassador
Mm.
because he had come back to his home country, no longer the Soviet foreign minister, and at this epic making moment in history with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now he's the head of this state, this country, which is trying to pull itself together and pull itself up. And for, again, an extraordinarily surreal experience for me as somebody who had, stood outside and looked at this behemoth of, the Soviet mass. And then just being in people's homes again, just developing relationships with other human beings, seeing them happy, seeing them disappointed, seeing them hopeful, and just forging relationships. The human aspect is always, and I've never lost that sense of thrill. And I can dial it forward to now here in Jordan. This is my second assignment in Jordan. And it's terrific to be reunited with many people, and in some other cases to develop new relationships. But, there again, my mother and father died while I was here in this current assignment as ambassador. And who was I, who was it who I could lean on and who knew me fairly well, and vice versa. And, I was surrounded by, the expressions of sympathy, of course, from American friends and from colleagues, but also from a collection of Jordanians who, I now knew fairly well, and who really stood by me in this time. So there's just sort of an endless series of snapshots in time. And, one day, in the not too distant future, this too will end, as in, my career as a diplomat, and I'll go back to the States, and I'll have a lifetime of memories. Most of them, of course, are positive and warm, occasional moment of sheer terror. Yeah. And a lot of fun in between. But just to, for me, it's been extraordinary that I could make this life of mine. I don't know that I made it per se, but there are a lot of accidents in life and a lot of things you can't really plan for that brought me here to this moment, including this moment of the podcast with you. There's no grand design in any of it. It's just how the chemistry or the elements of my life came together.
Right. And what an incredible life you've lived thus far. Your daughter had mentioned, and you had also mentioned earlier in the interview, that you've become more curious about your Assyrian heritage and trying to, put pieces together of a puzzle and your roots. What has sparked your curiosity and interest?
I think undeniably the loss of both parents. I think being an only child, I don't have siblings that I can pull some of this from. And also as a parent, wanting to leave my children a legacy of this is who you are, and part of understanding who you are, aside from what you make of yourself, which I don't control at the end of the day, whether any parent wishes to or not. At the end of the day, there's a part of that you just can't, and for which I am grateful. But I'd like them to understand two quite different sides of where they come from, because they have a heritage as Mainers and New Englanders, which sets them very squarely back in predominantly Great Britain. And that's one side of them. And that's who anyone sees when they see their face or they see their names. Mm-hmm. But there's a whole nother side of them that's almost like, did you ever see that TV show that was popular? I think it was Netflix, Stranger Things.
No, but I've heard of it.
Okay, so it's like there's this inverted universe, right? There's this other dimension, that you, unless you're capacitated to see it, ordinary folks. So to use maybe the Hogwarts example, what are the normal people called? The non-warlocks, they have some term for them. Anyway, so, unless you're capacitated to see platform number 9.5 at, say, Charing Cross Station, all you see is platform 9. You don't know that between the walls, there's this whole other world. Sure. And so for kids who are of mixed heritage, this is really important that they understand this is where you come from. This is who you are. It's got some huge strengths to it. And it has some incoherencies as well, because, at your optimal, you're one half of whatever that is. Right. So I don't think it's a downside. I don't worry about that. I've never thought that way. But, sometimes even within your own culture or cultures, you may have some difficulty, not day to day, going about your life, but being accepted as, you're kind of a half breed. So I don't mean to suggest that I've thought that that's something that they think about, nor that I do either. I never thought that way, and nobody ever threw any of that at me. But the 21st century now is a different world than the one I started out in, and their environments and their factors and whatever the next chapters will be for them as they go forward with or without me in their lives anymore. It's going to be a different experience for them, and it doesn't have to be mine. But I want them to know this part of themselves, and I would also like to be able to give back. I mean, we still are a stateless people.
Mhm.
We still are.
Mhm.
And we have suffered epically and extraordinarily. I don't think that should be our signature going forward, suffering and so forth. But we also can't step away from it and deny it. But the story isn't told, and that means justice has not been done. And that does bother me because I deal with stories like that and have throughout my career, and also even leaving career stuff aside, just as an amateur student, if you will, of history. And all of that still is not addressed here. We haven't had that moment. We're still kind of that weird, Assyrian gang who are having a picnic on there's an ethnic group having their day or
Mhm.
their food. They're eating their food over
Mhm.
there in the corner at some park.
Mhm.
And okay, I don't. There's nothing wrong with that per se, but I still think the story really as justice not only to the people and particularly those who did suffer and more particularly died and usually brutally, the story is told. And we haven't managed to do that too well. Occasionally there have been some attempts to do it and some tries, but for the most part, I feel unfulfilled there. And I feel an obligation to do that. I really can't take it on, at least not in in an advocacy role in my current role, because I'm a U.S. official, and that's not my mandate here as U.S. official, and particularly as ambassador here. My duties are other than that. But speaking to you as who I am in this podcast, which is Henry Wooster, who also happens to be this other side that's not so evident, this private citizen, and this person who happens to be Assyrian. Yeah, that's very operative in my mind.
Right. I couldn't help but you'd mentioned that being half breed. The last episode that I had done was with a group of people who had married into the Assyrian culture. So they're not ethnically Assyrian, but married in Assyrian. And one of them made a comment that kind of stood out to me, which was that, when they raise their children, they want them to know that they can be fully Assyrian and fully, whatever the other component of it is, and want them to feel that way and not necessarily feel like they are half of something. So I think you've done a really great job with that because when I've conversed with your daughter, she has a great deal of knowledge and understanding of who she is and her Assyrian side. And credits to you for that. Credits to your mother as well, because she had mentioned that her grandmother, your mother, has had a great deal of impact and influence and understanding, who she is and all about her Assyrian heritage. Your family has a scholarship held in memory of your mother. Could you tell us how you all decided to honor her in that way and what that scholarship means to you personally?
We call it the Rita First Generation Scholarship, and it can be found on bold.org. And the idea is to honor what my mother did. And my mother was just an extraordinarily giving person. I'd like to think I'm that good, but I know I'm not. She was just had a soul that was crafted differently and was hugely giving. It was not only what she believed, it was also who she was. So she didn't have to fabricate, oh, I should put my nice face on.
Mm.
This is just who she was. Maybe you and I can say it would have been nice if she'd had a little bit of selfishness to give to herself. I'm saying that a bit tongue in cheek,
Sure.
but she always put others. She always put others first. We've all heard about that sort of value, and maybe we've all known someone like that, or maybe not. But certainly she was that in my life, and my children all knew her as, not only as small children, but also as adults. And then literally it was they who held her in their arms while I was overseas as she died. So the daughter who you spoke with put together, really did all the homework. And in fact, as you and I speak today, has just queued up yet, the round of interviews of finalists that we're doing. The idea is that we honor what my mother did, which is, you came as an immigrant to a new country, and in my mother's case, several of them, and you made sure that others could have what you could not have. You really enabled others, and you had some sacrifices. It cost you. It really cost you, and not because your checking account got debited. That's fine, and it's not immoral to cost you that way. But it really cost my mother in terms of opportunities. But she was so committed that others should have this. So this was true of her own family. It was true for me, and it was true for my children. Without her and what she enabled, and mind you, again, this is someone who I told you what she did in terms of education, her own, and work. So this is not somebody who, came to the streets and then, became a Silicon Valley wizard. She never had much, but she always took what she had and ensured that, this will go for you, because she had seen with her own eyes in her family and with her son what education could do. So she became a huge believer that, with this, and particularly in a place like America, you can have opportunities that would have been unthinkable, and unthinkable even if maybe you had this education in other places, because you can do these things and you can step up to things that you wouldn't have been able to even think about. And what she also appreciated was, when it changes your life, it changes also the lives of your children, because now they will have a different baseline, a different starting point in terms of what they think is even a possibility for them to dream about. And that doesn't mean they all need to get, first off, even college educations, much less anything more, and nor do they all need to become doctors, lawyers, judges, or some such thing. Not at all. But the fact is, you'll have opportunities and doors opened for you. So her scholarship attempts to honor all of that, which is really her ethos and her approach. And that's what we aim to do here. We deliberated a fair bit about, should we take this money, and mind you, this is from my mother's and father's savings, what they had. And should we take this, and should we try to put a little bit of money into a whole bunch of pockets? I don't know what you do with $300, 500, whatever. Certainly as a student, I would have appreciated every penny of it. But, where you enable, I don't know, the buying anymore, textbooks were always expensive, and today they're insanely even more so. So you enable a couple textbooks for a course for a bunch of kids, or do you take the money, sink it into a person, and really aim with that to try to change a life, and through that life, paying it forward through them. And we decided to do that. So the other is also a contribution, and it's also valid, and every student who's out there who's in need would welcome, of course, either one. But our decision was to do it this way.
Right. It's a hefty amount of money. Could you remind me what the dollar
So I
amount
think
was?
today it's about, it varies a little bit by contributions on top of the base we've established. I think it's 35,000.
Right. So,
And so we aim to really put it into, one student and say, here you go. We want this to change your life and to change the opportunities you would have had otherwise, or wouldn't have had more particularly.
and something that I love about it, aside from everything that you had mentioned, is that your daughter, I'm assuming your daughter had written up the description of it.
She did.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
She's the
and
hero here, not me.
intentional or not, but
Yeah.
it really allows every student who comes by that scholarship, and especially who wants to apply for it, one informs them about who, of course, your mother is, but who the Assyrians are. Might
Mhm.
be the first time that they'd ever heard about Assyrians. And they're probably going to do their research about Assyrians if they want to apply for that scholarship, right?
Right. Right.
So, just the ability to have that level of introduction to so many students, because how many applicants have you had? Thousands, right?
2,771. Yep.
2,000 plus
Yeah.
applicants at the very least have had to, have read that, have looked into that, if not
Right.
more, viewing it. And I just think that that's so incredible. It was a very, when I had seen that, I was like, wow, this is such a unique way of also being able to like honor who Assyrians are and have it be an introductory way for other people to know who Assyrians are and what they have gone through modern times. So I find it incredible. I commend you and your family for doing that, because it really is a life-changing opportunity. I work with students who are in first in their families to go to college, are low income, and something like that literally is life-changing. So amazing for you all for being able to honor your mother in that way.
No, it's a real pleasure, not because that's the right response to in polite society, but because it very much is. And you really hope that you can really have that effect for anyone in over the course of your life. And this is a means, that we know with core certainty that my mom would really applaud.
Sure. Yeah. Ambassador, the last question that I have for you is, we have listeners from all around the world, Assyrians who tune in. What is something that you would like to say to them?
I follow as many of these as I can keep up with in my spare time, meaning typically in the evenings and on the weekend. The different social media presences is really the only way I can track the multitude that are spread all over the place. And I see a yearning in many cases for people to, particularly folks younger than me, to find a way to bring some coherence to their identity, to who they are, and I see a search for it. I also see a few people saying, "Here's the way. This is the way it should be. You should sign up to this." And I've watched this before because I'm old, because I'm older. I've watched this before. I'm thinking particularly of someone older than me, my uncle. And I was disappointed that there were so many intense divisions within the Assyrian community. So I'm not naive, and I don't mean to suggest that, oh, my tea was upset one day because somebody doesn't share my view or someone else's view, but just I would like to see a search for a bit more common ground, um, and to be able to unify around that. A little less suspicion, of the motives. And it's fine not to be a naive. I get it. Not everybody out there, Assyrian or whoever they may be, maybe has your best interests or mine. And I get that just as a human being. But and then and it, there's a desperate need for leadership, and that's not a ding on anyone. That's just, how do you take a community that is, to put it in modern industrial terms, a distributed network. So we've got large pockets of communities in Europe, Australia, Canada, the States, within the States, in various places, and so on down the line, the Middle East. What do you, other than, hey, I have a common heritage with you, but other than that, what do we do? How do we pull that together? How do you forge something out of that? And what is it that you need to forge out of that? I see some people still, who post the, hey, I'm back in the homeland thing. I mean, typically it's Nineveh Plains or something. Okay, and hey, everybody should want to band together and come back here. And if you don't, you're not a good Assyrian. Basically, if you don't want to do that. And then I see folks who are on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. So I realize, again, more as a human being than as an Assyrian, look, you've got a disparate collection of folks. They're of this age and that. They're of these talents. They're of these interests. And, but is the unifying theme among us going to be, Sheikhani? Or is that really it? And so this is not a critique. It's really just a question. And please, it's not a critique masking as a question. What do we want, and how will we go about determining that? We watched the Jews be a stateless people throughout time until they weren't in 48. Is that the model? We watched the Armenians who had a place, even though it was separated out, and the Armenian diaspora was all over the place. Still, they had a base, and then they had a country. What's the aspiration, and what should that be? And realizing that just like among Jews or Armenians, or pick any group, not everybody's going to share it. But is there a consensus view about who we are and what we ought to be, or do we instead go to a more a more 21st century space agey and frankly virtual model where we remain focused on a function and an identity, but not so much a form, as in a place or a venue. And we accept that this is who we are, and we are spread out in so many of these places. What is in common are the following things, the heritage, the history, the language, whatever. But we work with that. And I love what the Assyrian Policy Institute has been doing. Are you familiar with them?
Of course.
I haven't been able to follow everything they're doing, but what I can keep up with, and I have spoken with them as well, certainly within the US system, and I would imagine the Canadian one is very similar, but the US system, and this is true in Europe and it's true in most places, you need organization and you need advocacy. And that even is whatever, notwithstanding your objective is to go back to the League of Nations 100 years ago and try to forge a state out of it. Oops, that didn't work out. Or it's something entirely different. And you need people who can educate others about why they should care. There's a whole lot of identity out there now, from your sexuality to your ethnic background to your color. There's a lot of identity coming at people now. And how do you escape from the cynicism of, it's the woke brigade? You escape from that. Another ethnic group with another crisis. People have hit fatigue. So how do you communicate against all that? Because it's not enough to say, by God, this is a righteously important thing. And, don't you realize people died? Shake them by their lapels. A lot of people have died for all sorts of things. That doesn't minimize it, but it also doesn't get them to care. So, how do you do that? And I'm just a huge believer in education. Educate, organize, lead, and accept the fact that not everyone, even within the tribe, within the community, is going to accept the vision. But if you've got at least 51%, you got something. If you got 60% better, if you've got whatever up in the math, all the better. But you won't get everybody on board with everything. But the suspicion and the casting aspersions and things about one another, we unite well, like most groups. It's not unique to Assyrians. When we perceive an outside threat, then all the shiving of one another drops, because hey, who the hell are they to be talking about us? And then we're banded very tightly, right? Brotherhood, sisterhood, the millet, who cares? We're all one. Forget if you're Shopatnai, Urushnai, whoever, we're all one. But when that drops away, it's back to the, and I don't have an answer to that. It troubles me, but I see shining spots as well.
Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Our reach continues to expand thanks to listeners like you who, by word of mouth, let their family and friends know about the Assyrian podcast. So if you enjoy this episode, please send it out to 2 or 3 people who you think would benefit from listening. Thanks so much, and see you next time.